Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our next installment of Casual Wednesdays as we continue this series on pain and suffering. There's a popular American phrase that I'm sure all of us have heard at some point or another, which goes like this. If there's two things you can count on in this life, and they are death and taxes. Now, the object of this lesson is not so much to talk about the American tax code. I've got opinions about that, as I'm sure do you. But what we're talking about a little bit today, and what I would like to explore, is kind of the idea that suffering and pain and even death are not just random things that happen in our lives, but maybe there's a sense in which those things are part of God's call on our lives. The reality is that every single person, Christian or not, every one of us is called to die. And I think that vocation is as much a calling from God as is say a call to professional ministry, such as Pastor David or myself have. And sometimes the call to suffering and the call to death comes without warning. Sometimes it comes very, very suddenly. And sometimes it comes with quite a bit of advanced notification. But nevertheless, that call to suffer comes to every single one of us, and it should be pointed out that it always comes from God. Now, when I use the term calling, or when I use the term vocation, I want to be a little bit careful to make sure that we understand that I'm not talking about necessarily what a person's job is, what a person's career is in that sense. I'm not talking about what you do that makes you money. Whenever we have a discussion with somebody whom we've just met, inevitably the conversation will frequently turn to a question that somehow goes like this: what do you do for a living? And so we respond oftentimes with examples of the jobs that we do or the careers that we sometimes follow. I can remember, and I've had that happen to me many times as a minister, and there's always some degree of uncomfortableness when people find out that I'm a minister, and it usually comes after I've been talking with them, and perhaps they've been using some language that they probably wouldn't use around a minister had they known that I was that. I can even remember a couple years ago being here in Palm City on the golf course with another member of our church. And we were paired up with another duo of guys. They were from up north. They were down here on spring break. And so we played golf with them just down the road there at Hammock Creek. And I kid you not, every other word was a 4-letter word. And, I didn't say anything about it at first. I mean, it's, I grew up in sports. I grew up in college locker rooms. So I certainly have heard that language before. And, but at a certain point, the gentleman who was with me from our church was so embarrassed and felt so ashamed that my poor tender ears were being forced to listen to this. He went up to the other two guys and he said, hey, I just want to let you know that Brad here is actually a pastor in a local church. And of course, once they heard that, they were so apologetic about it. They were so embarrassed and so ashamed. And I had to tell them, hey, don't apologize to me, because it's not my name that you're taking in vain. I'm not the one whose name you're running down every time you say, the words Jesus Christ. And so it was kind of an opportunity for me to at least maybe try and get across the point that, you should act and live in a way that recognizes that God's the one who's watching you all the time, not necessarily the local minister. So, that's happened to me more than on one occasion. But often when someone asks us what we do, we respond with answers that talk about what our careers are, what we do for a living. But in a historical sense, especially in a Christian sense, a vocation is much more than a job. A vocation is much more than what we do to earn money or what we do to pay off bills. A vocation really comes from a Latin term that really means a calling. And in this sense, the Bible isn't just referring to people who are ministers, although there certainly is a call to ministry that certain people receive from God. But it's the idea that your calling is something different from that. I can remember many stories. Now, I never met this person, but I can remember many stories over the years here at Palm City Presbyterian Church about a man who was very instrumental to the formation and kind of the growth of our church, and that was Joe Kordick. Now, he passed away, I think, shortly before I came to Palm City, but his wife, Phyllis, is still here and involved in our church and involved in our community. But a lot of his friends would say, and Pastor Dick used to say this all the time, that when he would introduce himself, he would say, hi, my name's Joe Kordick, and I'm a full-time disciple of Jesus Christ. And then he would say, I use my job as the vice president of the Ford Motor Company to further my use and my qualifications for being a disciple of Jesus Christ. Now, it's no secret that Joe Kordick was a very, very successful businessman, rose about as high as you can go in the Ford Motor Company, and was very generous in his contributions towards the church. But that's not how he saw himself first and foremost. Joe, he was one of those individuals who really had a strong understanding of what his vocation was. And that's why he would introduce himself that way. He wanted people to know that first and foremost, his vocation, his calling was not about what he did at the Ford Motor Company, but it's what he did as a disciple and as a follower of Jesus Christ. And I think that that's such a fantastic example for the rest of us who are still living to realize that, our calling is what Christ has called us to. And that calling can be upon our lives. It doesn't have to be just for people who are called to ministry, but you can have a Christian vocation or a Christian calling, whether you're the butcher, the baker, or the candlestick maker. And that's usually, one of the hallmarks of the Protestant Reformation is that when nations like Switzerland, Germany, Great Britain, and even America to an extent, when those nations began to embrace the principles of the Reformation, they suddenly saw normal everyday work as having a spiritual value. They saw themselves not just working for their bosses, but they saw themselves as working as though they were working for the Lord. So whether you were involved in the legal profession, or if you were involved in medicine, or you were a construction worker, you were doing those things in God's service. And it's certainly no accident that once that concept took hold in the Reformation in those countries, the productivity in those countries just, skyrocketed and shot through the roof and gave way to what we now call the Industrial Revolution, which is basically the basis or the groundwork for productivity that we have all throughout the world right now. However, in spite of all that, we don't often think of things like suffering or pain as being part of vocation. We don't think of things like death and suffering as being part of our calling. And when I think about it, I've visited many colleges. I'm getting ready to send my oldest child, Jacob, off to college here pretty soon this fall. And I visited colleges and universities. I've visited many seminaries and academic institutions. I've never once come across an academic institution or a school that had a graduate degree or even an undergraduate degree in pain and suffering. Now, I've certainly seen courses and classes in pain management. That's not the same. That's not what I'm talking about. That's something a little bit different. But I've never seen a class at any academic level that talked about suffering in the sense of God's calling upon our lives. And yet, I think it would probably be safe to say that there are times in a person's life where they may not be in the banking industry. They may not be called to medicine. They may not be called to be a teacher or in construction. But the calling in that may be what they do, but the calling in their life, the vocation that God's put on their lives, might just be to suffer. Now I know that sounds, for a lot of people, that sounds very, very radical. As a matter of fact, that's That's the exact opposite message as what you'll hear in the so-called health and wealth traditions that we have going on in America. But I think, and I'm going to try and show some examples of the Bible. What I want to try and show today is that the God of the Bible, the God of Christianity, the God of our faith, is a God who not only is very familiar himself with suffering and with death as well, but there are examples in the Bible of well-known characters and well-known people for whom that was God's call in their lives. Now, the most famous example probably is the story of Job. Whenever we talk about suffering, whenever we talk about what seems like unjust pain or maybe unexplainable hardship, we frequently come back to this character who has a whole book in the Old Testament dedicated just to him. And that's the character of Job. Now, he's a hard person to talk about, especially from a historical sense. We don't know where he's from. We don't know who he's descended from because his parents, his lineage isn't given, which is very unusual, very odd. We don't even know if he's an Israelite. We don't even know if he's descended from Abraham like everybody else in the Bible. So he's kind of a hard character, but what we do see in his story, I think, are some very important principles. And the first element we see in his story is kind of at the beginning of the book where it describes all the angels in heaven are called to come before the throne of God. And guess who shows up? Even Satan is allowed to show up. And he's given permission by God. He's called by God to come and kind of present himself. And so he does, and he asks permission from God to kind of cause some mayhem, to kind of cause some calamity in Job's life. And so by doing that, he thinks that Job will renounce God and it'll prove to God that Satan is totally in control of everything. And so he in a sense tries to use Job. He tries to use Job as a way to mock God because, he thinks that he's in total control and that nobody is listening to God anymore. And so God responds, he responds to Satan by saying, have you considered my servant Job? Well, Satan responds to that question and basically says, hey, God, of course Job worships you because look at all the nice stuff you've given him. I mean, Job is at ease in Zion. He has everything a man could ever desire. He's living in the lap of luxury. But you know something, God, if you were to remove all that stuff, if you were to take away all that wealth, all that prosperity, if you were to let me afflict him a little bit, then God, I guarantee that his attitude towards you would not be all that jolly anymore. And so he raises the question. He raises the question that's this. He says, does Job serve God for nothing? Now, so Job's been given everything, and Satan basically thinks that that's the reason why Job is faithful. That's the reason why he's loyal to God. Well, you know the story. Job is allowed to create some mischief. He's allowed to create some pain and suffering in Job's life. And he loses his wealth. He loses his property. He loses all 10 of his kids. I think he's got like 7 boys and 3 girls, and he loses them all in one fell swoop. He loses everything. And then on top of that, he's afflicted and he's tormented with these painful, kind of incurable skin diseases that they didn't have any kind of ointments back then like we do now. He didn't have Advil or Tylenol to take certain pain away. He had to endure this pain day after day. And he's very tempted to turn his back on God. And it's in the middle of all this pain, all this torture, all this trauma, that his own wife, okay, now this is Mrs. Job. Now, Mrs. Job has gotten a lot of attention in theological history, but his own wife comes to him, and she basically tells him these words. She says, "Curse God and die." Now, I have to say, when your own wife is giving you advice like that, friends, you don't need enemies. Okay, when you're married to somebody who basically says, it would be better off for you just to be dead. You don't need any other hardship. You don't need any enemies in the world. You don't need anybody persecuting you any more than that. Trust me, that is enough persecution to have to deal with that from your own spouse. As a matter of fact, speaking of church history, John Calvin had a nickname for the wife of Job, for Mrs. Job. And that nickname in Latin was this. He called her the Diabolus Adjutrix, which is Latin for the term devil's advocate. That, trust me, that is not a compliment. That's not a term of endearment. Years later, not to be outdone, but years later in America, Jonathan Edwards, who was a very strong Reformed preacher up there in Northampton, Massachusetts, he also came up with a nickname or a title for Mrs. Job, and that was this phrase. It was also in Latin, and he referred to her as Satani Organum, which is Latin for Satan's instrument. Even in my own life, I can remember one of the first times our family ever went out to Southern California. As something that we did as young kids all the time. My dad would drive nonstop all the way out to California. And one of the sites that we got to see in California, of course, was Disneyland, but not far from Disneyland was a church, a very special church called the Crystal Cathedral. Now, ironically, it's not owned and operated by the same company or the same church anymore. But I can remember even as a little kid walking through the grounds, and of course there were beautiful statues and beautiful artwork and all kinds of things. But there was one statue, which was a statue of Job. And on the bottom of the statue, it was a quote from Job chapter 13, verse 15, which says this: "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." Now, when you think of all that pain and suffering, when you think of all the things he had to endure, you're left with the question, how could anyone endure that kind of treatment and still be loyal? How could anyone say, though he slay me, yet will I serve him, yet will I still hope in him? And, his wife comes on the scene. She doesn't really offer any encouragement. He has three friends who come on the scene, and they're almost as bad, or if not worse than the wife. They come to him and basically say, these guys are the self-appointed kind of self-help theologians of the day. And they come and basically say that, Job, the reason you're suffering is because you have committed a terrible, terrible sin. As a matter of fact, either there's something you're not telling us, or there's something that you're not even aware of in your own life that's causing all this pain and trauma to happen in your life. And so these three friends of Job basically thought that there was a direct correlation, a direct link between the suffering and the pain that he was feeling, and somehow the sin and evil that was part of his existence, part of his own experience. And so they think that the things that afflict the human race are because the human race has fallen. Now, it's certainly true that the human race is fallen, but these guys thought that there was somehow a direct correlation and a connection between the level of your suffering and what must be the level of your sin. Now, of course, that is not very comforting for people who are enduring things like terminal cancer, for people who endure things like depression, which is ongoing, things that are, involve a lot of pain and suffering for many, many years. That is not a comforting message to them at all. Well, finally, Job turns to God. And, doesn't get good advice from his wife. He doesn't get good advice from his friends. Finally, he realizes, I'm going to turn to the Almighty and maybe see what he has to say. So he turns to God. He basically says, Lord, why is this happening to me? And, it's interesting that God does not respond with this type of answer. He doesn't say, Job, here are 3 reasons why you're suffering. Okay. Doesn't that kind of sound like a typical sermon title in today's day and age here in America? 3 reasons for suffering. He doesn't do that. God answers Job in a very Jewish manner. It's very Jewish in its style and in its manner of speaking. But he answers Job's question with another question. And for a while, you get the sense that maybe God is avoiding Job a little bit, or maybe he's avoiding the question, but in a sense, he's really not. And it goes like something like this. First, he asks Job this. He says, Job, where were you when I laid the foundation of the world? That's a pretty tough question for Job to ask. Not only did he not know where he was, he didn't even know that he was when God laid the foundation of the world. Now, another question, God says, who shut up the sea with doors when it burst out from the deep? Well, again, Job has no answer to that. God says, have you commanded the morning to rise ever since your days began? Well, of course not. Those are things only God can do. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion, which are references to star constellations in the heavens? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds that a flood of waters may come over you? Can you send forth lightnings that they may go and say to you, here we are? It's just question after question after question. And every single one of course, Job has no answer to any of that. At one point, God even says, can you catch the great sea serpents in the ocean with a 10-pound test line? Job, guess what? I can. And in a sense, he's not answering Job's question directly, but in a sense, he is. He doesn't answer directly, but he rather shows who he truly is by asking Job this set of questions. It's almost, as in a sense, you get this idea that Job's getting clubbed over the head with all these impossible questions. But in a sense, God is kind of showing Job a little bit of who he is in these questions. It's almost like God is saying, Job, look at all these things that I can do. I can tell the sun when to rise and when to set. I can tell the stars in the heavens where they're supposed to be. And Job, if I can do that, do you really think you're in a position to question or to complain to me about what's happening to you? So, it's so like God to do this. And we especially see this in Jesus's own life. Instead of getting an answer, Job gets a person. Okay, he's not going to answer Job's questions directly, but rather he shows Job how much control he has over the whole universe. And once Job sees that, he realizes, God was right. I don't have the right to question whether or not God is in control of things, because look at all the things that he can do. If he can tell this morning where to come, if he can tell the sun when to rise and when to set, he can certainly have control over the small affairs of my life. I can remember a story that Dr. Sproul used to tell once in a while, where he was telling another story about Martin Lloyd-Jones, who was a famous pastor in London in the beginning of the 20th century. And it was a story that a woman had come up to him one time and asked a question that went like this. She said, is God concerned about the big issues in my life, or is he also concerned with the small issues in my life? And Dr. Lloyd-Jones turned around to her and said, Madam, in comparison to God, every issue in your life is small. And that was just kind of his way of reminding people, there's the things that we think are big issues, the things that we think are major life-threatening issues, for God are no problem. They're no big deal. Another example. So there's the example of Job. Another example that I really enjoy is the example of the blind man from John chapter 9. Let me read a few verses from this passage here. John chapter 9 says, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, notice again, the disciples of Jesus are doing the same thing that Job's three friends did earlier in the Old Testament in the book of Job. They thought there was a direct correlation between pain and suffering and human sin. And so they asked Jesus, was it this guy who sinned? Is that why he's born blind? Or was it the man's parents who were? In verse 3, Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with mud. And he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. So he went and washed and came back seeing. So the disciples come to Jesus with this question. And the question is, basically, what's the cause of this man's blindness? What's the reason this man is blind? And of course, they do something that in philosophy is called the fallacy of the false dilemma. And that means this. They tried to reduce Jesus's options down to only two choices. Okay, kind of like the old skit with Jack Benny. That story. He'd be up there on stage and someone would run up to him and pretend to have a gun in their pocket and say, your money or your life. And Jack Benny, who was known for being pretty cheap and kind of a miser with his money, he would stroke his chin and basically say, let me think about it, as though he somehow valued his money more than he did his life. But that's kind of what the robber in that story does. He reduces your choices down to two. And the reality is that sometimes there might be more than two reasons for a particular situation. There might be more, there might be three reasons, there might be 4, 5, 6, 7. But these disciples are trying to make the argument that either it's this man who's at fault, the blind man, or maybe it's his parents. And Jesus comes along and basically says, nope, neither one of them. Okay, and a matter of fact, you see the same thing in the story of Joshua in the Battle of Jericho, where the night before the Battle of Jericho, Joshua goes out to have some quiet time. He goes out to maybe think about battle strategy or something. And he comes upon this very imposing figure, and Joshua does the same thing to this angelic figure that Jesus' disciples do to him. Here's from Joshua chapter 5. It says this, and Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or are you for our adversaries? Okay, we hear that in politics, in military language all the time. You're either for us or against us. Verse 14, and he said, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord, and now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped. Now notice, Jesus does the same. As a matter of fact, I think the person that Joshua meets actually is Jesus. That's another conversation for another time. I think Joshua is seeing what we call a Christophany. And I say that based on the fact of how he responds. He falls on his face and he worships. And the commander of the army of the Lord accepts that worship. So Jesus answers his disciples by saying, it's not this man or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now, how on earth is the majesty of God made manifest in human suffering? Think about that question for a minute. Think about the suffering that you have in your own life right now. How is the work of God, how is the majesty of God made manifest through that suffering? Do you think that guy in John chapter 9 ever imagined that for 2,000 years of human history, people would be talking about him and would be talking about how Jesus touched him and gave him his sight back? Do you think that he ever imagined that in 2,000 years, people in Palm City, Florida would be talking about this guy and what a miraculous event he allowed to have happen to him and did happen to him through the work of Jesus? Do you think the only reason that he was born blind was that so one day that the only begotten Son of God could come by, just wandering by on a stroll, and give him his sight back just so that he could demonstrate the power and the majesty and the grace of Christ? You want to know what I think? I think if that guy had known that back then, he would have gladly spent a whole nother lifetime in blindness. He would have gladly died and come back again blind just so that he could show and be part of the demonstration of the glory of Christ. Now, he may not have known it at that time, and guess what? We don't either. We don't know how our pain right now brings glory to God and brings glory to the work of Christ, just like that guy back in John chapter 9 did. So, that's an example of how God can use our suffering. And 2,000 years later, we're talking about the pain and we're talking about the miracle of God's work in someone's particular life. Well, we've talked about Job, we've talked about the blind man in John 9, but of course there's one more character who understood pain and suffering to a degree that you and I, very few people, if anybody else, will ever understand. And of course, that's Jesus Christ. In fact, I would probably be safe to say that the whole purpose for his birth and life here on earth was to both live and also to die. We see that in several different passages. There's the story of his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. And in Matthew 26, he says that Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and two of the sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Well, why is Jesus sorrowful? Why is he so troubled? It's because he knew what was about to happen. He knew what was on the horizon in the next 24 hours. He knew that his suffering, his passion, what we call the passion of the Christ, was right upon him. And we see this idea of his passion and his suffering even predicted about him even when he's a little baby. When in Luke chapter, I think it's Luke chapter 2, his parents bring him to the temple to be circumcised. It's the 8th day according to the tradition. And there's this old prophet there named Simeon. And here's part of the text. It says, "Now there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon, and this man was righteous and devout, waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was upon him. And it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ. And he came in the Spirit to the temple, and when the parents brought the child Jesus to do for him according to the custom of the law, he took upon him in his arms, he took him up in his arms and blessed God and said, 'Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, that you have prepared in the presence of all peoples a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and for you glory to your people Israel.' And his father and mother marveled at what was said about him. And Simeon blessed them and said to Mary his mother, 'Behold, this child is appointed for the falling and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign that is opposed.' And then in parentheses, in verse 35, it says, 'And a sword will pierce through your own soul also, so that the thoughts made from many hearts may be revealed.'" So even at the very beginning of Jesus's life, this prophet talks about a sword, a calamity, piercing the soul, piercing the heart of Jesus's own mother. And so even at the very beginning, we see that his destiny, his life, his vocation involves death, involves a very terrifying and painful death. We see this in the story of when Jesus gets lost as a teenager in the latter part of chapter 2 of Luke. Jesus gets separated from his parents. He's back in Jerusalem. They finally catch up with him. They find him. And they scold him for a little bit, and he responds back to his parents, and he says, "Don't you know that I must be about my Father's business?" So, he says that very cryptic line. What does it mean to be about his Father's business? Well, it means that at least by the age of 12, he knew that there was something different about him. Okay? He knew that he was different from other kids. He knew that he had a special calling. He knew that he had a special identity then. But when we talk about Jesus's being about his Father's business, the reality is that he doesn't really start that business for another 15, 16, 17, 18 more years. It's not until he's 30 years old that he begins his public ministry. And to be honest, for the most of his public ministry, he keeps a very low profile. He doesn't go around performing tons of miracles to draw attention to himself. He does perform miracles, but they're not. He doesn't broadcast them in the sense. He doesn't send out flyers and say, hey, this Sunday night, come to the big tent revival meeting and expect a miracle. So some scholars refer to that notion of Jesus as kind of keeping quiet about himself as what we call the messianic secret. He keeps his true identity hidden, at least for a little while, until he can't really keep it hidden anymore. And at one point, he gets together with his disciples, and he asks them, what's the local scuttlebutt going on amongst the population? What do people say about what we're doing? What do they say about me? Who do people say that I am? And some of the disciples answer, well, some people think that you're John the Baptist, come back from the dead. Some people think you're Elijah. Some people think you're one of the prophets. And then finally he asks, what's your opinion about all that? Who do you think I am? And Peter, jumps to the forefront, and for one of those rare moments in his life, Peter kind of lives up to his potential. And he gives that great statement, that great conviction where he says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus responds very positively to him. He even gives him a name change at that exact moment when Simon has that great confession. He basically says, "Hey, that statement was so great, Simon, I'm going to change your name because of it." And he changes his name to Peter at that point. And then let me pick up the text after this. And he says, verse 21, he says, "From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised." Now, here's the critical part. Remember what Peter just did and the blessing that Peter just received. Verse 22, "And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, 'Far be it from you, Lord.'" Well, that far be it turned out to not be very far at all, did it? "Far be it from you, Lord, that this shall never happen to you." So after receiving this wonderful blessing about being instructed by God, being touched by the Father, Jesus then turns around. His first act as Peter, his first act as this new rock of the church and of history, is to, number one, rebuke the second member of the Trinity, to rebuke the person whom he's just claimed as the Messiah. And then the second thing he does is he gives a false prophecy. Now giving a false prophecy in the Old Testament was enough to get you stoned, okay? So Peter not only rebukes God and basically lifts himself up higher than God, but then he does something that's actually worthy of capital punishment. Well, Jesus responds to Peter, verse 23, Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." So Jesus basically, after changing his name to Peter, which means rock, Jesus basically calls Peter the devil. And you ask yourself, how could somebody be so blessed and in such a short time have screwed up so much in such a short period of time? Well, it's because when Jesus started to explain this idea that Messiah would be identified with suffering, that the Messiah would die, that was totally unacceptable to Peter. And I probably have to guess that it was probably unacceptable to the rest of the disciples as well. Okay, they didn't want a Messiah who would suffer. They wanted a Messiah who would conquer. Not only do we see that in the New Testament and the Gospels, we see that in some of the books that are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. They saw Messiah as someone who would conquer, and they thought it was Israel who would be the suffering servant from Isaiah 53. Israel suffers, Messiah conquers. And then Jesus comes along, and he does the very last thing that anyone expects. He chooses, he willingly takes on. He takes on a vocation of pain and suffering. So we see in the garden, we see Jesus express his own grief. As a matter of fact, the Bible says that he sweat, he cried drops of blood because he was praying. He was crying so intently in his pain. And I'll make this comment too. If Jesus can cry, if Jesus can express grief at that level, guess what? Then so can we. Okay? If he did it, then you and I can cry as well. It's appropriate to cry and to grieve because guess what? Jesus did it as well in his lifetime. Now, I know, one of the comments that I hear once in a while goes like this: well, Jesus' suffering really didn't last that long, Pastor Brad. Matter of fact, he was only on the cross for just a couple hours, and then it was over. Jesus, we have people in hospitals today who've been dealing with terminal cancer for years. We have people who've been dealing with diseases and with ailments and with broken bones for almost their entire lives. Doesn't it seem like what they're dealing with is more difficult? But remember that Jesus's pain, his affliction, wasn't just the nails. His affliction that he dealt with wasn't just the physical pain of being nailed up there to a piece of wood. Remember, he was also afflicted with the pain and the sin of every sinful experience, every human experience that was ever endured by one of his sheep. He had to endure the suffering and the pain of every single one of his elect, not just who had come before him, but even those of us who are living today. He was subjected to every single bad thing that you and I have ever done, said, or thought. And guess what? That was his vocation from the very beginning. That was his job, his calling from the very, very beginning. So it's no wonder that when he goes into the garden and, he sees his vocation upon him, he's tormented in his soul. It's no wonder that he says to God, Lord, if there's a way, if there is any way possible, let this cup, let this vocation, let this calling pass from me. And the reality is that none of us would want to drink that cup because that cup, that vocation was much more than just physical pain. It was much more than just physical suffering, but it was the spiritual pain of sin of every single one of his sheep in all time in history. And yet God the Father looks down at him at that moment and he says, you're going to drink this cup because Jesus, this is your vocation. And Jesus basically says, if that's what you want, then I'll drink it. Friends, remember that Jesus does not go to the cross hopping and skipping. He does not go to the cross whistling a merry tune like the seven dwarves or how many, 8, 9 dwarves, how many they are. Okay. Jesus goes to the cross crying and in agony. And to be honest, the only reason he's willing to do that, the only way he could have gone to the cross willingly was this understanding. He had to understand that it wasn't the devil that put him up there. He had to understand before going to the cross that it wasn't unforeseen circumstances. It wasn't chance that put him up on the cross. I want to throw the television through the window sometimes when I hear ministers on TV talk about how, Jesus's mission was to come and create some type of political establishment here on earth, and Satan just concocted some plan, and through the use of the Jews and of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Pontius Pilate, somehow Satan just kind of manipulated the whole situation, and Jesus was never meant to be up on a cross. But Jesus gets up on the cross, and God the Father kind of looks down and basically says, well, when life hands you lemons, make lemonade. Folks, that is not what happened on the cross. God does not make lemonade out of lemons when Jesus dies on the cross. It wasn't circumstances that put him up there. It wasn't Pontius Pilate, even though he's the one who ordered the words. It wasn't wily old Caiaphas or his father-in-law Annas who somehow got Jesus up there. Jesus is willing. He endures the cross because he knows one thing. It was God's call on his life. He knew that it was his heavenly Father who put him on that cross. He knew that his cross, that cross on Calvary, was his vocation. But friends, it doesn't end there. And here's the good news, and I'll leave you with this. Whenever God calls us to suffering, whenever God calls us to calamity and pain, and yes, when God calls us to death, he always gives us a way, a means to endure. Faith doesn't end with suffering and death. Suffering and pain do not have the last words, the last word in our lives. We don't sing the song, "What a friend we have in pain," or "What a friend we have in death." Faith doesn't end with suffering, and guess what? Death does not have the last say. That's why Paul can say in Corinthians chapter 15, he can say, "Where, O death, is your victory?" We need to remember that the Christian faith doesn't end on Good Friday. Hallelujah and amen. Thanks again for listening to this latest installment. We'll have one each Wednesday night. And we hope you keep on listening. And it's appropriate to be talking about this and listening to these issues during this time as we deal with a lot of pain and suffering going on in our world, in our culture, in our country. And none of that pain and suffering is going to be resolved by looking to government, by looking to politicians, not even necessarily by looking to each other. Okay? It's only going to be resolved. It's only going to be taken care of by looking to Jesus Christ, because he is the one who has dealt with our pain. He's felt our pain, and he holds our hand in the midst of our pain. Hallelujah and amen.